Regardless of what is announced in the coming weeks, the countless images of long lines of Albertans standing in the snow to attest that they want a divorce from the rest of the country warrants a deeper look as to where this sentiment is really coming from, and it goes a hell of a lot further back than I personally assumed before I really dove into this. Regardless of if you support this initiative or not, by understanding the past, we can understand how we got to this present, and maybe we can control where we go in the future. So, if you want to understand why Alberta is threatening to break up with Canada, we need to go back, way back, further than the birth of the province. We need to go to its conception. The year is somewhere in the 1800s, like mid-1800s. The beaver fur hat was losing popularity. And if you wanted to send a text, you need a fancy machine and 2 dudes who understood Morse code. The Americans had just purchased Alaska, because apparently that was an option. The Hudson's Bay Company saw this move and started to think, maybe we should stop betting on the beaver and cash out. At this point, they still owned a huge portion of what is now Canada, at that point called Rupert's Land. But since HSBC was technically a branch of the UK, they needed Queen Victoria's blessing to sell. Now, her great-great-grandfather had been publicly humiliated by the Americans over some tax-free tea relatively recently, so the crown was not about to let another chunk of the map fall into Yankee hands. So, Queen Victoria encouraged them to sell this land to a new settlement in the east, Canada. Now, very important to remember, Canada in the 1800s is not the same nation we know today. The OG Dominion was just Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. And for the sake of this story, we are just going to focus on Ontario and Quebec, the original power duo, the Golden Children, and Daddy Ottawa's absolute favorites. Now, this matters because Alberta and Saskatchewan were the surprise younger kids in a dysfunctional family. By the time we even joined the Union, the older siblings had already picked the best bedrooms, set the curfew, and wrote the house rules in permanent ink. Now, America was still in its manifest destiny phase, and despite sounding like text on a motivational screensaver, this doctrine was basically just finders keepers, but like with guns and bodies. So many bodies. Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, knew he needed to get settlers out west ASAP to secure Canada's claim, and he needed to know if the downstairs neighbors were starting to eye the spare bedrooms. Plus, the East was industrializing. They needed a captive market to sell to. But how do you convince a bunch of people to move to a harsh environment to do backbreaking labor? The same way that TikTokers convinced an entire generation that the ultimate status symbol is those creepy little troll dolls. Marketing. Enter the Last Best West campaign. They thirst trapped the fuck out of this land, and since this was in the days before Photoshop, they used stylized paintings that showed the rugged beauty of the mountains and the wide open sky. Always in summer though. And to make this offer even better, free land. That's right, baby. For the low cost of a $10 administration fee, which adjusted for inflation is only $500, the Dominion Lands Act of 1872 promised you 160 acres. Terms and conditions do apply. I know what you're thinking. Hold up. Don't people, already live there? Yeah. The Indigenous and Métis people have been there for generations. But don't worry. Daddy Ottawa is working on some new laws, and he promised them that they're going to get their own little patches of land where they can make their own rules. And, to sweeten the deal, free education. As with all things that seem too good to be true, it was. And the conditions to keep this land were deceptively simple. Be a man, or a widow, but preferably a man. Cultivate 40 acres. And build a house on the land in the next 3 years. The catch was, if you failed to upload any of these agreements, you were going to lose your land. If you ever wondered why flying over Alberta looks like a giant quilt, the parceling done for this project is the exact reason why. Once the new settlers arrived and experienced their first winter, they probably started to understand why they got such a good deal. But for a time, things were actually going pretty well. You could make a decent living planting in the spring, harvesting in the fall, and avoiding the cold in the brutal winter. Selling crops to America was financially fruitful, and being close to the American farmlands gave them an easy way to get high-quality equipment to make the backbreaking work less backbreaking. From high upon their ivory tower in Ottawa, a decision was made. The National Policy of 1879. On its surface, it seems like a respectable nation-building policy. Build a railroad coast to coast, keep bringing settlers west, and promote made-in-Canada goods via everyone's favorite financial instrument, tariffs. And of course, the province set to benefit most from this arrangement were Daddy's favorites, Ontario and Quebec. To say this is bad for the provinces is a bit of an understatement. It was absolutely brutal. The farmers were caught in a no-win situation, because remember, the condition of their free land was that they absolutely had to keep farming it. This is like being given a free printer, but now your ink costs $8,000 and you're legally obligated to print 500 pages a day. And if you don't, the government's going to come and take your house. These tariffs forced Western families to buy expensive equipment from Ontario and Quebec factories instead of cheaper, better tools from the US. When the West tried to complain, they basically just got left unread. Papers in the East, written for and by the posh elites, proclaimed the success of this national policy with a level of self-congratulation that borderlined on the erotic. And all of this happened before Alberta was even a province. When Alberta and Saskatchewan were officially born into the family in 1905, the rules were set. The core and the periphery dynamic was baked into the birth certificate. The East benefits from the labor at our expense. I believe in this concept I like to call original sin in relationships. And the idea is, typically in a relationship, there's like a something that happens probably around the very beginning. Now, this is the betrayal that gets brought up in absolutely every fight. Even 20 years later, 3 beautiful kids, your wife is still out here talking about that one time you texted your ex when you guys first started dating. Now, it doesn't matter how long it's been. If this is left unresolved, it lies there, dormant. And for Alberta, the national policy was this original sin. Because Dad says he loves us all equally, but he obviously has some favorites.
For 3 decades, oil companies had been drilling with only limited success. Searching. Then in February 1947, 20 miles south of Edmonton, near the little town of Leduc, Alberta, Imperial Leduc No. 1 struck oil.
From that point forward, oil became so much more than just the black, oily sludge harvested from the earth. It became our salvation from the shackles of Ottawa. And you know the type. That guy that made a killing on a random shitcoin immediately quit his job to become a day trader? The guy who won't stop talking about Bitcoin arbitrage and to the moon? This one win became his entire personality, the same way oil was no longer just a resource. It was a lifestyle. Our best hockey team is literally named the Edmonton Oilers. And we literally open every game by making the boys skate through oil derricks that shoot fire. Even our other hockey team, the Calgary Flames, only has that name because when they moved from Atlanta, the owner was like, you know what? We're in Oil City. Things burn here. Still fits. Fast forward to the 70s. While the rest of the world was still reeling from an oil shortage, caused by some stuff going on the other side of the world. We won't get too deep into that. Alberta was living its absolute best life. The U.S. markets were thirsty for our thick black sludge to feed their industrial machine, and we were more than happy to be the ones holding the tap. Now, this was the era of Peter Lougheed, who kicked off 44 years of progressive conservative rule. Lougheed was kind of like the responsible older brother who actually knows how to manage finances. He played hardball with the oil companies and established the Heritage Fund to ensure at least some of those profits stayed in our own bank account and compounded for generations. Now, we probably would have a lot more left in our sovereign wealth fund had we continued to contribute to it, like a country like Norway did. But after Peter, that was no longer a priority. For the first time in history, the youngest kid in the house was the one with the biggest paycheck. We were winning, we were thriving, and we were about to buy our Lambo and move out of the basement. But, as any kid who starts making more money than their parents knows, that's usually when the household contributions conversation starts to get a little weird. While Alberta was busy riding the oil boom and pricing out its own downtown, the golden child of the family, Quebec, was having some feelings. You see, they were feeling culturally threatened. They felt politically sidelined. And to be fair, in a country that treats anything non-English as basically a special interest, it's a pretty relatable combo. But Instead of just starting a podcast about it, a small extremist group called the FLQ woke up one day and chose violence. It's hard to explain how far they went to someone like maybe you and definitely I, who were not around back then, but like they bombed mailboxes, they kidnapped some officials, and they like killed a sitting senator. So what does Daddy Ottawa do? He panics.
There's a lot of bleeding hearts around who just don't like to see people with helmets and guns. All I can say is go on and bleed, but it's more important to keep law and order in this society than to be worried about weak-kneed people who don't like the looks of a soldier.
At any cost? At any cost? How far would you go with that? How far would you extend that?
Well, just watch me.
Meanwhile, back west, we didn't bomb anything. We didn't kidnap anyone. And we didn't even threaten violence. We were just staying on the grind. We were doing our 14 and 7. It was dirty work, but it paid a lot better than farming. And oil money started to transform the skyline. Instead of the gloomy concrete buildings that kind of gave off like Soviet Russia energy, we started commissioning shiny glass towers extending into the skies and giving endless views of the fields. I mean, there's mountains if you're in Calgary, but in Edmonton, you can see very far. Endless sky, as they say. Thanks to oil, Alberta was becoming the economic engine of the country. We were winning. That brings us to the dinner table argument that gets brought up in every Albertan sovereignty debate. The equalization payments. Now, originally, the plan was simple. The two wealthiest provinces, Daddy's favorites, would share a bit of their allowance so that the smaller provinces could afford the same basic stuff. Schools, hospital, roads, infrastructure. But in the 70s, the family rules changed. Suddenly, natural resources were counted in this math. Now, before you close this video, I'm not saying this agreement is inherently evil or not evil. In 2020, Alberta actually received a net gain of $10.9 billion from the feds, but that's not always brought up here. But a lot of the time, the graph does look like a one-way street heading east, and that really does fuel the populist fire. In 1980, disaster strikes. Pierre Elliott Trudeau is re-elected. Eastern Canada is still struggling because they rely on imported oil and prices are still through the roof. So Ottawa decides it's time to step in and stabilize things. They introduce the National Energy Program, and on paper, it's about national unity. In reality, it does three things. It caps Alberta's oil prices, forcing us to sell cheap to the east. It redirects our profits to the federal treasury, and it controls who we sell to. If you listen very closely, you can faintly hear it. Our oil. The impact of this was genuinely brutal. Unemployment jumped 10%. Bankruptcies skyrocketed 150%, and between $50 and $100 billion of economic impact vanished, which in today's money is closer to like $400 billion, approximately. And that's why your grandpa still probably brings us up at Christmas. It was like financially dramatic, and it really stuck with people because everyone was in some way, shape, or form impacted by this. Even if they weren't directly, they knew someone who was. And imagine losing $400 billion because your dad decides that even though you got a good job, your older sibling is still employed, so they deserve a cut. Even though they recently did some light treason.
There's a good chance I may have committed some light treason.
While Alberta was eating the fallout, Ottawa was busy basking in Quebec's special status and actually added those transfer payments into the new constitution, making sure that younger child's allowance was legally bound to the older sibling's lifestyle forever. Now, this gave birth to a new slogan in the lexicon of Albertan bumper stickers because we've done a surprising amount of our expression of political discontentment through bumper stickers. Now, this one's pretty iconic and is sometimes mistakenly attributed to either Ralph Klein or Peter Lockheed. And the quote is, "Let the eastern bastards freeze in the dark," but it appears to just be a bumper sticker thing. While Alberta was nursing its post-NEP hangover, the Golden Child was still feeling some type of way, a lot type of way. So, in 1995, Quebec held a referendum to ask voters if they should stay in the family or move out for good, and the no side won by less than 0.5%. Like, it was tight. Afterwards, the Supreme Court stepped in and ruled that even a yes vote wouldn't have given them the automatic right to dip out. But they added a major caveat. If a clear majority voted yes on a clear question, the rest of the family would have a legal obligation to negotiate in good faith. This was codified in the Clarity Act of 2000. Basically, the court gave the family a set of fair divorce rules, and Alberta was watching from the sidelines, taking notes. Shortly after the world did not fully end on Y2K, 6 prominent citizens published the Alberta Agenda, better known now as the Firewall Letter. It was addressed to Premier Ralph Klein. If you didn't live through the Ralph Klein era, he was kind of like if Rob Ford was Albertan and his drug of choice was wine instead of crack. He was called King Klein at the time, and he made it his personal mission to eliminate Alberta's debt. After 14 years of austerity measures and privatization, he celebrated this success by sending everyone in the province, unless you were locked up, $400. He's got a lot of iconic moments, like he showed the middle finger on TV. There's quite a famous story where he walked into a homeless shelter, berated them for not having jobs, and then threw money on the floor and left, and then 2 days later came out as an alcoholic. Like, he had a lot going on. He really did give Rob Ford energy. Now, this letter told Ralph it was time to put a firewall around the province and take control of a few key areas where they technically had provincial jurisdiction, but had been provided by the feds. Their demands were simple. We want our own pension plan. We want our own tax collection. We want our own police force. And we need more direct democracy. We need more referendums, because if we've learned anything from the internet age, there's nothing more stable than a group of large people with a submit button. I guess they didn't really know that yet, but oh boy, would history prove not a great idea. But it was a bold move. And the great irony here is that Ralph Klein, the king of Alberta, King Klein, basically pulled an Ottawa, and he ghosted them. Like, he didn't respond. I think he, in a couple conversations, referred to their tone as negative, but that was basically that. He realized that their demands were asking for a lot of paperwork, and he just went back to the bar. Now, you may have caught it, but one of the authors was a young up-and-comer. You may have heard of him, which is funny because it's like discovering if your lawyer used to run a pirate radio station and sell ripped DVDs out of the boot of his car. Like, it's a shocking revelation. Now, when Stephen Harper became PM in 2006, his priorities evolved. Because it turns out when you're trying to govern a whole country, you can't just campaign like you're only running for mayor of Calgary. You need those votes east of Manitoba. And those votes, they come with expectations.
After years of scandals, people see a new government that will work for all of us, not just insiders. They see a new leader who's more like one of them, someone who will take a stand and tell it like it is. Now, after all these years of corruption, it's a bit hard to imagine a real change. But more and more people are thinking just that. Vote Conservative and stand up for Canada.
Now, the early 2000s brought a brand new topic to the dinner table: climate change. Let me be clear, the internet has no chill, and I'm not here to litigate science. There are millions of documentaries and graphs about the ecological impact of the oil sands, and if you want more detail on those, you can watch Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth. Because when I was in grade 7 in Alberta, I swear to God, I watched Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth an unconscionable amount of... I don't know why we had to watch it more than once, but I swear that we did. Now, here's the thing. Albertan oil was still paying a lot of the bills, and Alberta was still propping up a lot of the household's lifestyle. Those equalization payments were no joke. And suddenly, the thing that made the province successful was being reframed. And not reframed as a challenge that we can transition through together. We can grow together. We can solve this. No, this was a moral failure. Like, you're killing the world type moral failure.
No more oil! Keep your carbon in the soil! Climate action! Now! What do we do in the land we live on is under attack?
And my point here is not disregard concern for the planet. It's the sequence of messages that Albertans received. They didn't hear, we need a credible off-ramp and we're all going to share the cost. Well, what Alberta heard was, the job you do is a problem and you should feel bad about it. With no replacement, no realistic timeline, and zero acknowledgement that the house was built with the oil money. Also, Leonardo DiCaprio showed up at some point, and he actually ended up making a documentary about the impact of the oil sands. And I swear to God, this still gets brought up at Christmas because now his ecological impact of his private jet is quantified compared to the output of the oil sands. And yeah, there's a lot of anger about the moral righteousness that people who did not depend on the oil sands would come here and then they would just get to benefit by calling oil bad. Jump to 2021. You might remember this as being the year after we all stayed inside for a long period of time, and some of us were still kind of staying inside. Online politics were heating up a little bit, and out of nowhere, a lot of people just started asking questions. And in September, a policy proposal called the Free Alberta Strategy gets published. Okay, also, a little side note. Barry Cooper's author bio, which is the first page of actual words in this thing, includes a line that his book was recovered from Osama bin Laden's personal library when he got visited by SEAL Team 6. And this is true. It's in a lot of his bios. And he's a very accomplished man. But it just was not what I was expecting to read on page 4 of this document. And the phrase visited by SEAL Team 6 is doing a lot of work. It's doing a lot of work. This document proposed a series of recommendations that the Premier could implement without Ottawa's approval, really echoing the Firewall letter's core themes. But they added a new and very important ingredient, the idea that Alberta should be able to establish international trade and market access relationships independent of the federal government. Translation: why don't we just go negotiate with them directly? Why do we have to go through you? The Free Alberta Strategy was hosting panels, including then-candidate Danielle Smith. So it should not be super surprising that when Smith won the leadership in October, her signature legislation, the very first bill of her entire premiership, is the Alberta Sovereignty Within a United Canada Act, which is a title that is it's complicated on Facebook, but make it a law. I'm not leaving you. I just need independence. We need a little bit of space, but we're still married, so you can't cheat on me, but we do need a little bit of space. It's complicated. Now, this law gives Alberta a mechanism for MLAs to decide whether federal initiatives deemed harmful to Alberta should actually be followed through. Basically, we've reviewed your emails and we've decided that we will not be actioning this at that time. But for federal laws, there is legal debate on if this is constitutional or not. During the debate of this bill, Smith dropped a quote that perfectly captures the modern Alberta posture. It's not like Ottawa is a federal government, which is a wild thing to say about a federal government, but a very Albertan thing to say about our federal government. It's the sound of the youngest child finally telling their parents, you're not the boss of me. You're just the people who happen to live in the same house. And I'm paying the bills. Doesn't that make it my house, my rules? To keep things on brand, the first major use of this new sovereignty was to challenge the Trudeau government's plan for a net zero electric grid by 2025. Because if Alberta has a brand, it's basically, when in doubt, argue about energy. Alongside the challenge, the province ran a large advertising campaign aimed at Ottawa, a throwback to an earlier era of Canadian protest aesthetics where politics comes with a side of vehicular symbolism. We love a good bumper sticker. By the dawn of 2025, the vibe in Alberta was, well, you probably saw the flags, bumper stickers. Everyone was done, and people were just unhappy with the Trudeau government, who had now been in power for 10 plus years. They were like spending their entire Saturdays protesting on an overpass with a bunch of randoms type unhappy. Polls showed Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre was a shoo-in. He was basically already measuring the curtains for the Prime Minister's residence. But then, two very important things happened that threw the entire family relationship into a tailspin. First, President Trump started his second term by announcing sweeping tariffs targeting Canada. And he didn't just want our trade, he was full-on floating the idea of us becoming the 51st state and emasculating Justin Trudeau at every single turn. Suddenly, being Canadian starts to feel like a slightly better deal than it did last week. Then, the other important thing is that Trudeau did the absolute unthinkable. He stepped down. And on January 16th, right here at Edmonton, Mark Carney stepped up. And Mark Carney's first move as Prime Minister, before he even called the election, he abolished the carbon tax. What followed was the largest bag fumble of all time. Pierre Poilievre didn't just lose the election, he lost his own seat. Then he had to wait for an MP to resign so that he could continue as leader of the opposition via a by-election. And if you want to know how weird our politics get, just look at that by-election ballot. Because of a protest against our voting system, called the Longest Ballot Initiative, there were 214 names on that sheet. Look at how long it is. It's thick. People were actually getting like 0 votes. Like a lot of people got 0 votes. Could you imagine running for office and your own spouse looks at the list and goes, hey, you know, I actually think Dave from down the street would represent me better. And then you're just distraught and I guess don't vote for yourself either. And then after the election, Mark Carney continued on his tour of doing unexpected things by placating Danielle Smith. He signed a memorandum of understanding promising to cut the red tape for a proposed pipeline to the BC coast, with the goal of selling our oil to Asia, decreasing our reliance on U.S. trade, and increasing investment in carbon capture, and inviting a lot of private money into the mix. Both sides seemed, honestly, pretty happy. Of course, this wouldn't be Canadian politics if someone wasn't left fuming. The BC NDP and Indigenous communities were rightfully pissed off about this pipeline. They're essentially the downstairs neighbors who didn't sign off on the new renovations. They're going right through their living room. Now, even with Carney now trying to play the good partner, the old resentment in Alberta is still simmering. We've seen national policies before, and we're like the spouse who finally gets a sincere apology, but they're still checking their partner's phone while they sleep. They want to believe it's different this time, but the history books are right there on the nightstand. And while the parents are in the kitchen trying to work it out, the kids are in the basement plotting their escape. So, if you remember, one of the core propositions of our Firewall letter in 2000 was more direct democracy. So, following that trend, the government did indeed lower the bars for direct democracy. And I suspect they just thought people weren't going to actually care enough to do the paperwork. They figured they were too busy complaining. But they underestimated the lengths an Albertan will go to be petty. So 2025 became the year of, fine, I'll just do it myself, response to political engagement. While the government was busy front-running the calls for a referendum, a group called the Forever Canadian Petition, led by former Deputy Premier, mobilized a small army of volunteers. They spent months doing the most Albertan thing possible, walking through snowstorms to ask their neighbors, do you agree that Alberta should stay in Canada? And they collected over 400,000 verified signatures. It was a clear, loud signal that while people were mad at this marriage, a huge chunk of the province still wasn't ready to pack their bags. Then, on January 2nd, 2026, a new headline hit our homepages. After months of illegal back and forth, Elections Alberta had finally approved the referendum question proposed by the Alberta Prosperity Project, the APP. The question was, do you agree that Alberta should cease to be part of Canada to become an independent state? No longer just a Facebook poll or those weirdly aggressive AI ads that I get on Instagram sometimes.
He once caught an NDP supporter trying to give puberty blockers to a child. he politely dealt with it in the most Albertan way possible.
The starter's pistol had been fired. The APP now has until May 2nd to collect 177,000 signatures to put the question on an actual ballot for every voter in the province to answer. The man leading the charge is the CEO of the APP, Mitch Sylvester. Now, for legal reasons, I want to be very clear. The APP is emphasizing that Mitch himself is bringing this forward on his own behalf as a voter, even though they're kind of taking victory laps in their press releases. At least their other press releases. And their slogan, or one of their slogans, I'm a little confused about their graphic design strategy. Faith, family, and freedom. It's the live, laugh, love of political movements. It's simple, it's punchy, and it's officially the largest threat to our 150-year-old family since the 1980s. Which brings us to the wild card in this high-stakes divorce, because while Alberta is looking at the exit, the guy living across the street has changed again. Donald Trump's second term has been different. He's a little older, he's a lot more into crypto, and he's decided he should be the only one that gets a say. Old, rich, incredibly successful neighbor, and that happens to have the exact same values as the angry side of Alberta. And he isn't condemning the oil and gas industry for their carbon emissions. In fact, he celebrates them, while the rest of Canada is essentially telling Alberta, your job is morally questionable and we need to talk about your carbon footprint. This guy across the street is basically just shouting, no, you're doing great. Oil is power. Keep it coming. We want more. And that feels validating, dangerously validating. Because when an older, much richer neighbor starts to tell you how grown up you are, how much you don't really need your stifling family anymore, how mature you are, how independent you are, and, you should really think about getting your own place. And then he whispers that he'll even help you pay for the move. Well, it starts to feel a little bit more like... If you made it all the way to the end, thank you so much. This was my very first video, written, recorded, and edited all by me. So if you liked it, like, comment, subscribe, do those YouTube things. And if you hated it, consider telling me why. I would love to put out more videos like this, and I would like even more if a couple people saw them. So yeah, let me know.